This is a conversation with Patrick McGee, and it's perhaps a bit of an unusual episode. Patrick is an author of a book called Apple in China that tells the story of how the world's most valuable company came to China to use it for its own benefit, only to discover over time that it was Apple that was being used, trapped, and effectively working for the Chinese state instead. But despite the title, this isn't just about Apple. It's really a story of how China changed over 2 decades, how it eventually gained leverage over Western corporations, squeezed them for everything from know-how to capital, and used them to build homegrown rivals, now competing globally. It's a story about how China uses economic dependency to build political influence, and how it uses political influence to create economic dependency, and about how aggressive, smart, and strategic the Chinese government can be when pushing for its own interests, and how the West, to its detriment, often fails to see that until it's too late. Even though the story is from the perspective of a private company, it's just as much about China, the West, and their relationship, which is why I think it's deeply relevant for geopolitics as well. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon and Substack, to whom I'm deeply grateful, and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes, and additional bonus content. And if you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, I also write a newsletter where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find the link to that in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure, Dominic.
So we're going to be talking about your amazing book, Apple in China, which, despite the name Apple in China, is, in my view, about a lot more than just Apple. And when I read it, to me, it was more a story of how China uses global and Western companies to fuel its own rise, and how it uses economic dependency to create political influence, and how also over the past 2 decades that pretty much fundamentally changed the balance of power between China and the West, which is why I think all of that matters for a geopolitical podcast. And the way you describe it in the book is, to me, it seemed like a bit of a classic rise and fall narrative, when at first Apple comes to China and it starts using it, only to later then turn it into China using Apple. And maybe to explain that, let's start with the first half of the story of the rise of Apple in China. So if we can maybe explain what actually first brought Apple to China, and how both the country and the company massively benefited from the partnership.
I love the way you described it. Well, what's interesting is it wasn't pitched that way in a certain sense at all, right? Like I think now I would describe it myself as if you're interested in sort of China's rise and U.S.-China tech rivalry and so forth, hopefully my book is sort of a layperson's guide to getting there, because it's sort of meant to be as sort of entertaining as possible rather than academic. And you're just following a company that we all know, or at least think we know. Certainly we're familiar with their products. And then sort of China sort of exercising more and more leverage is what happens. But I didn't know a lot of that going in, right? So I went to sort of pitched it as such, because the reporting is what gave me that narrative, rather than having an idea and then pursuing it. Let's see. I think what's worth knowing is that we're talking basically about the world's most valuable company. It's since changed since I published the book, but just for simplicity, let's say that. And, the world's second largest economy. So the partnership here, the marriage, if you will, is two absolute giants. But, my book is really like the meet cute in the earliest stages, when Apple is a flailing company. I mean, they are almost bankrupt in 96, 97, and again in 2000. And these are the years that they're beginning to flirt with China. And China is, 1/8 the size, maybe 1/10 the size of the US economy in 2000, or the next year when it joins the World Trade Organization. So it's not the meeting of giants, right? And that's really worth knowing, because a bunch of decisions that get made on the part of Apple, first of all, is at a time when they're just trying to sort of save the company. They're just trying to keep going. The iPod, people sort of don't remember, was not a success when it came out in 2001. It's sort of like a design hit, but a production, or rather a market failure for the first 2 years or so. And China at this stage is just known for, manufacturing poorly made stuff, right? I mean, made in China was synonymous with poorly made stuff, and as recently as 2000, probably even 2010. I think some people even today think of China as made in China as poor. So it's just worth really remembering, or perhaps learning for the first time, that it wasn't two sort of strong men, in the form of like Tim Cook and Xi Jinping linking arms or something. We're talking about Apple making decisions out of like sheer desperation. They adopt a global outsourcing strategy in 1996 because they cannot afford to continue building their own computers. They have to sell a factory in Colorado. That's the beginning of the book. And China is just joining the World Trade Organization, sort of just becoming an accepted player on the world stage, and really just embracing capitalism. I mean, it is only in 1988 when private businesses are legally allowed to operate in China, right? So the emergence of China is just so recent. And something like Foxconn, the Taiwanese manufacturer that's most associated with building Apple products, I mean, they don't go to China until 1987, and then they begin building dormitories to house workers throughout the 90s, because otherwise people are going to have to sort of take these big commutes, and the villagers that are coming over from the hinterlands, they don't have the money for their own apartments and things like that. So it's remarkable how precarious the whole thing was on both sides, how poor the company and the country were when they sort of first started getting together. And then you look back on it today, and it just looks like China's clearly not on a march towards democracy, but it is on march to being the world's largest economy. And Apple just had a new presentation releasing new iPhones. I mean, they are operationally just absolutely excellent. But the story is, I think, so much more complex and nuanced. And I try to be more fair about it, because there's just a lot of actors and a lot of happenstance that sort of leads us to the situation we're in today.
I think it's really interesting that you put it that way, that it was actually not two giants, but two underdogs at the time, and then they together kind of grew rich. Can you maybe explain what, because you've hinted at what China meant for Apple, but what Apple at the time meant for China, or what companies like Apple coming to China meant for the country and for the development of the economy?
It's probably worth stating this, as counterintuitive as this sounds. It doesn't even make a whole lot of sense to talk about what did China see in Apple, in 2000 or something like that, because China's not really an actor, right? It's not that Apple is meeting officials in Beijing or something. It's that Shenzhen is this special economic zone where essentially the rest of the rules of the country don't apply. And it's individual entrepreneurs that are linking arms with Apple. And in particular, it's Terry Guo, who founded Foxconn out of a shed in a city whose name in Mandarin translates to Dirt City in Taiwan. So 2 years older than Apple, right? Which is, two Steves in a garage in 1976. And he sees something in Apple. And really what he sees is that Apple, beginning in 1998, is building computers that look nothing like any other computer. I mean, if you can just go back and remember the beige box computers of the 1990s, nobody cared about the aesthetics of the design. Nobody cared about how they were manufactured. There was nothing sophisticated about how they were manufactured. They were being built in places like Japan, but then later Taiwan, and then later China, purely because of cost and scale. But Apple, sort of stuns everybody with this Bondi blue iMac. I mean, just the idea that a computer is named after a beach in Sydney, that alone in a world of beige computers is very strange. But it also had really pushed plastic injection molding to the total limits of how you could actually operate with these tools. It was transparent. The circuit board and so forth were like inside. It was really the rebirth of the 1984 Mac insofar as it had, computers. I'm sorry, a computer, obviously a computer. It had speakers, it was like an all-in-one unit. It had a single cord that went to the plug. Whereas, usually you had like this just terrible mess of like 32 pin connectors from the monitor to the computer itself. I mean, just the sort of revolution that Steve Jobs sort of imagined alongside Johnny Ive to come up with this thing is sort of clear to anybody who lived through that time. But we've never thought about, well, how did they actually build it? Was it difficult to build? Who built it? And so forth. And it's not Foxconn originally. It's actually LG in Korea. And then when LG successfully does this thing with a lot of hand-holding from Apple, they begin building them in Mexicali, I should say, in Mexico, and also in Wales. And this was the story that just hadn't been told before, even though there's some news clippings from those countries at the time. And I just got really excited about that idea because I realized I didn't know basic answers to how did Foxconn get involved? And, long story short, LG really sort of screws up the international expansion of building these products on 3 continents. Terry Guo kind of pounces. And Terry Guo is not the person you know him as now. I mean, if your audience is familiar with him, you might know that he ran for president of Taiwan the last two cycles. And I only mention that just because that helps you understand the ambition of this person. He really is like the Henry Ford of Asia. And as early as 2001, again, Taiwanese company operating on the mainland becomes China's biggest exporter. Really hard to overstate his contributions. But a lot of them have been made by him recognizing how original Apple was, and that whereas most companies did not want to work with Apple because they were so challenging to work with, they had this like perceived superiority of their products, a certain arrogance with how things were done. But Terry understands that the operational difficulties of working with Apple are the reason to be involved, because if you can please Apple, you can please anybody. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but what I'm really saying is it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say, what did China see in Apple? China's not really in the picture. Despite it being in China, it's people like Terry Guo and other suppliers. They see something in Apple. China doesn't really enter the picture as like an entity saying like, who is this company and why are they exploiting our people, really until 2013.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important, but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. So let's maybe look closer at that when China, because you sort of described how at first China kind of just was more of a passive actor that was just happy for companies to come in and get rich and make everyone rich. So let's move to the time when China does start to become an actor, and the government does start to play a bit more of a bigger role. Can you describe the transition of how we got there from the first original place that you described to when China did start to play a bigger role eventually?
So it's really easy to pinpoint because it's the day after Xi Jinping enters office as president in mid-March 2013. And I say that because the opening of the book, literally the first paragraph is CCTV. You could think of that as state-sponsored CNN in China, the national broadcaster, attacks Apple for warranty differences. And this is within 36 hours of Xi Jinping ascending to the presidency. There's something really remarkable about that because it takes even China watchers quite some time to figure out who Xi Jinping is, because of the legacy of his father, who was a renowned reformer, someone actually sort of operating in Guangdong province and helping Shenzhen become the special experimentation zone that it was supposed to be, and thrived. People thought he was a reformer. And it took a while to realize that he's more like China's Putin. And I remember I was living in Hong Kong in the first term of Xi Jinping. And I remember reading a New Yorker profile by Evan Osnos. I believe it's called Born Red, still worth reading. And I thought there might be some typos in his piece because of just how many communist officials had been purged, right? It was hundreds of thousands. And you just thought, surely it was tens of thousands, and even that would be high. I mean, I'm just saying, like, the numbers were staggering. And anyway, I bring this up because arguably the first entity to sort of really experience what Xi Jinping's first term was really going to be like, or what China was going to be like under Xi, was Apple. And they get completely attacked for perceived warranty differences, which sounds like a small thing. And the allegation is essentially that Apple, this global entity, is treating China in an inferior way. And I'll, sort of let the reader figure out what goes on there. It's an immensely complex answer as to what really happened. And there's a reason it starts the book. I think it's profoundly important for Apple. It leads to political awakening, which is part 5 of the book. But sorry, I'm wanting to link back to what your question was, which is, when does China enter the picture? Okay, I try to be, in a sense, sympathetic, if you will, to why Xi Jinping and the hardliners in Beijing are after Apple. And to be quite honest, let's say you were their lawyer, you would find, there's quite a good argument here. And so, I don't know that I can show you a visual, but if you could picture this, Foxconn, again, their most important assembly partner, was earning higher than 10% margins the first year that they really got together, which was 2000. And by 2012, so just when Xi Jinping would be looking at the most recent data, let's say, their margins have collapsed to 2 or 3%. And during this time, Apple had gone from something like 1% margins in, I think, 2003 to 26% margins. So my point is that the iPhone is very much the product of Apple and Foxconn working really closely together, right? It is Foxconn that is getting millions of workers, or at least hundreds of thousands of workers in their factories to build these products at scale, helping to orchestrate the supply chain, just doing so much. And yet, if you just look at their margins and profits, Foxconn is literally the most profitable organization between Apple and Foxconn in the first 4 years of their partnership. And then as Apple profits and margins just absolutely soar, Foxconn revenues Foxconn revenues go up, but their profits only inch up and their margins sort of collapse. Now, the book goes into great detail explaining why that is, and there's some justification to it. But if you don't know the reasons, it just looks like Apple is this exploitative company that is not in China for China, to quote what Xi Jinping would like to see. And that's just one example, but there are many reasons why hardliners sort of begin to see the iPhone in particular as this little pocket-sized emblem of capitalism and of the youthful appeal for individualism, Western purchases, a sense of luxury that's out of step with hardliner communist doctrine and so forth. And so Apple just becomes this entity that they need to attack. And then the narrative really gets going as to how Apple responds. How do they understand this problem? And then how do they go about solving it?
Well, let's maybe just continue with that, because it is quite a unique situation to find yourself in, from a country that you basically see as neutral place where just business gets done and your stuff gets made and you don't really have to care about politics, to suddenly you becoming a target, or the primary target, main target of a government that's quickly turning a lot more strict than how it seemed before. So what were Apple's choices, and what kind of strategy did they decide to go for?
I think Xi Jinping makes it relatively clear to a host of organizations within a few months of being in office, which is that your choice is basically to be in China for China. And if you don't like that, you can leave China. And certain companies are blacklisted, right? Google, Facebook, anyone who's Western that's really involved in services and content isn't really able to operate there. But they make it really clear that if you aren't sort of playing by the rules, if you're not setting up joint ventures wherein, half the company is owned by a Chinese entity where they're going to learn everything about your business and then thrive on their own, you're going to have difficulties. So if we put the Apple narrative aside for a moment, a company like Qualcomm undergoes a 3-year antitrust investigation that's essentially bogus from the start. But China's just upset with the model wherein every smartphone that's produced using Qualcomm technology has to pay a licensing fee. And there's something that feels unjust to them about it, but it's the global standard. And so they just go after Qualcomm. And well, how does Qualcomm respond? There's not a whole lot they can do. They're a nation state. What is Qualcomm going to say about a nation state that produces all of the iPhones and all of the Android phones? Qualcomm's got chips in all of them, right? And so they basically just launch a joint venture and they pay $1 billion fine. I mean, it's essentially a quid pro quo It's just a penalty for being successful and being on the bad side of Beijing. So they just have to pay $1 billion. It's the largest fine at the time, in history of the country. So that's a sort of climate that Apple's operating in. And what's worth knowing is that they are not only the most successful operator at this time, right? Globally, nobody has found so much success sort of building the world's most sophisticated supply chain than Apple at the time. But they're also the biggest Western retail company. So they had never prioritized China as a market, right? I mean, they were there because it's a large country of poor people, essentially, in the early 2000s. And yet, by 2010, and it's my favorite part of the book, which is the sort of birth of the retail market in China, the iPhone just goes gangbusters. I mean, it's not even the phone, it's the symbol of the phone. You want to somehow show that you are with it and cool. Instead of having a Louis Vuitton purse or a BMW, far more accessible is to get a $700 or $800 phone, right? I'm not saying that's cheap, but versus a $12,000 purse, $45,000 car, it is. So it just becomes the symbol, the thing that everybody wants to have in the country. And at the time, Apple has 4 Apple stores in the country, right? So you think about that as being 1 store per 350 million people. There's not enough product. And so these gangsters known as yellow cows are able to sort of become like a sort of gig economy where they are amassing huge quantities of these phones, going to cities where there's no Apple presence and selling them for enough money that they end up making more money per iPhone than Apple, which is pretty staggering because Apple is, becoming the world's most valuable company at this time. I'm sorry, I'm going off on these long tangents, and it's because I just get so excited by how much is in the book and how much story I want to tell. But your question was how do they deal with China, essentially?
Yes. What kind of response when you get under this political pressure? What was their strategy to deal with that?
Yeah, so once Apple realizes the stakes, right, that their $20 billion at the time business in the country selling to China is at stake, but also, even more importantly, the fact that at that point they've consolidated virtually all of their operations to the country. I mean, it's existential. And what's interesting, it's not really even being covered at the time. If there's an existential risk, people think it's the rise of Android. But it really is that everything's in China and there's no plan B. And so the only option really is how to placate or at least alleviate the pressure. There's not, why don't we go build all our phones in Mexico? Like that's basically not a realistic strategy. And so just because, like, people don't get this all the time because they'll say, if Apple has the engineering know-how, if they know how to build the phones, why don't they just go do it somewhere else? Because it's not just a problem of knowledge. The problem of scale, of cost, and of just things like logistics and infrastructure is just so difficult. And what Shenzhen in the early days was building, but then sort of China across major industrial clusters in Shanghai, Hangzhou, Chengdu, Zhengzhou. I mean, what they were just coming up with was just absolutely world leading, right? And this is why the early chapters of the book are what are sort of accounting for how Apple was building products when they were not in China, because without me sort of having to directly say to the reader why it was problematic, it's basically just demonstrated that if you're building in Taiwan, you just hit labor constraints. It's not an unending population of people. There are so few people available for the factories that laborers are flying up from the Philippines to fill the production lines. You don't have enough expertise on the island once you're building at scale. And so you're having to work with Japan, Singapore, Thailand, a whole range of other countries to do various parts of the products. And then they're sort of all coming together for final assembly, test, and pack out in Taiwan. China's just able to take sort of all of that excellence, all of that contribution, and just put it in like a single industrial cluster where, like, quite literally, instead of taking an airplane from one country to another to go figure out a problem or troubleshoot something, you're literally just walking 5 minutes down the road, right? Or you're just sending someone to go fetch someone from that factory, right? In China, they call this next door manufacturing. So what China is able to build by just having sort of greenfield sites where things, as I say, are sort of custom made for Apple's suppliers, nobody's just able to compete with that, right? Everyone always thinks it's the cost of the labor. The cost of the labor is important, don't get me wrong. It's baked into the equation, but it's more just like the absolute efficiency. It's how the labor is used. It's the fact that the factories are often running 24/7. And there's just so much labor. It just felt in the early 2000s and probably until the mid 2010s, just like number of people willing to take these jobs was just absolutely unending. it proves to have some limits, but it didn't feel like it at the time. That's what was so difficult to compete with. So Apple finds itself in this position of realizing we really can't go anywhere else. So how do we get authorities on our side? And they honestly don't know the answer. They've never thought about politics before. You have to remember, these are engineers and designers. They're thinking about engineering tolerances, circuit boards and batteries and stuff. They're not pontificating matters of state. They're not learning Mandarin on the side. It's just not their specialty. This isn't sort of like a sick burn. It's just not what they were thinking about. And as you said, I think you used the term playground. That's what China was for them. Maybe not all of China, but Shenzhen was just a multinational playground where rules weren't really enforced. And, the highest echelons of China's leadership would say it was an experiment. They just wanted to see what happened. They sort of weren't enforcing strict rules. So it was sort of like a grassroots attempt to look at what capitalism could achieve, and then we'll take it from there. So Xi Jinping really takes things in the other direction. So just to give a little bit of history, Apple has like 8 entities in China today. Back then, the first one was in 1993. So by 2013, when Xi Jinping comes into power, Apple's been in the country for 2 decades, but they've never had a senior person living in the country. There's no vice president or anything that has been living in China at any stage before 2013. So Apple has to figure out who are the China experts that we can either hire or that we can send to understand the country and be our eyes and ears on the ground. And this senior group of people that call themselves the Gang of 8 really come to the fore here. And they oversee everything in China: operations, retail, procurement, Apple University, R&D, etc. And so what you get out of that is a series of decisions. Basically, I think they're offering advice, and then the decisions would be made in Cupertino. But look, we have to have more of a sort of relationship with various provincial officials, right? And so out of that, you get 5 different research and development centers in major industrial clusters in China to demonstrate we're not just sort of like sending people from abroad to exploit your workers. We are training them at cutting edge levels of R&D. And the biggest thing they do is they come up with a supply chain study where they realize they're investing a staggering $55 billion a year into China. I often talk about just what that means in context, because it's such a big figure that good luck finding another corporation spending that type of money in another country. Just absolutely staggering amount of money. And what they're able to basically demonstrate is that if Beijing and provincial officials understand how much we are investing in the country by sending our best engineers to train, audit, supervise, install machinery for hundreds of factories across the country, Beijing will realize that the joint venture model that they've been touting the last few decades pales in comparison to what Apple is doing in the country. And this becomes so convincing that Tim Cook goes to Zhongnanhai, the citadel of communist power, in May 2016 to essentially explain this and submit a memorandum of understanding that they're going to take that $55 billion figure, multiply it by 5, and pledge to invest $275 billion into China over the next 5 years. So that's how they get out of it. They basically are able to demonstrate, if you have any idea how much we were contributing to your country, you wouldn't think we were an exploitative power.
There's a lot of things that I find really fascinating about that, but I guess the thing that I find most interesting is that when you look at it from Chinese perspective, it's actually really impressive that they managed to get a global corporation like Apple to invest so much money into R&D and training in a different country, which is what these corporations typically don't want to do, and these countries often get stuck in the low income category and never move up. And so it's actually really impressive that China, whether it was completely planned or it happened sort of maybe organically or partly by accident, that they did manage to squeeze so much out of Apple for their own benefit. I think it's quite an unprecedented situation.
I think you're totally right. And it's really worth knowing, because it's too easy to have a view like Senator Tom Cotton, who just basically writes a history of China as this evil nation, who's just always sort of exploiting different places and countries. And it's just like some awful actor on the world stage or whatever. I'm not saying there aren't some elements of that. Look, I find China a little bit scary, to be fair. But, China was able to use, in the early 80s onwards, a jiu-jitsu trick where what's the sort of biggest problem we face? Well, it's hundreds of millions of people living in dire poverty. So if they have a mechanism to lure in foreign capital where someone else is paying for, factories and machinery and so forth, and then our workers are getting trained up and getting jobs and so forth, that's stage one, and that's kind of great. And then stage two is make sure we're not a forever haven for low value work. So how do we move up the value chain? What pressure tactics do we apply to foreign corporations so that they're not just importing the semiconductors, they're building the semiconductor fabs here? I mean, there's something really rational and indeed impressive about it. And actually, you see elements of the Trump administration trying to sort of learn the same lessons and do the same things. It results in a whole bunch of things that I hate seeing, like every tech CEO sort of sucking up to the president as this mafioso boss. I mean, I hate that. But you got to understand that, like, China did this sort of thing, but without a free press really understanding what was going on. But yeah, sort of coercing companies to make decisions that would benefit their nation. And as much as you want to sort of begrudge them for it or whatever, China was as poorer, in fact, than sub-Saharan Africa when Mao died. And sub-Saharan Africa hasn't made those decisions. I mean, they're not a world threat or whatever, so that's why we sort of give them a pass. But like, the fact that they didn't make those decisions to realize we have a lot of poor people, how could we sort of get them working in factories or whatever? Like, that's a much bigger error than anything China's done, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I think you can definitely and probably should disagree with what the Chinese government is doing in some areas, but also still give them a lot of credit for what they've been able to do in other areas and I think this is one of them. And I would say that another thing that I find particularly interesting about this story that you've just described is how kind of a sudden and surprising it was to Apple and to all those companies, where I think they've believed and quite logically that they have all the leverage at first because they had the jobs, the technology, the revenue that they were bringing, and that China would need to fight and kind of bribe them to stay there. But actually, the opposite thing happened, and they had to kind of fight to be able to stay in China.
I can't tell you how relevant this is, because one question I get often is like, when did Apple realize like the tables were turning? And the answer, of course, depends on who you talk to. But I've had people that have left Apple after having a whole career there, where they were negotiating deals, let's say, they're somewhere in the procurement value chain working with Chinese suppliers. And they've said up until reading the book, they always thought they were the ones who had the power. Because people would tell me things like the red carpet was rolled out for us everywhere we went. And again, these aren't, geopolitics majors, right? They're not listening to Decoding Geopolitics in their spare time. They are thinking about engineering. And so I'm not sort of trying to criticize them. I'm just saying this isn't their specialty. They know how to build stuff in a way that you and I cannot build, right? But they're reading very different books than you and I. And so they're just not asking the question, why is the red carpet being rolled out for us, right? It's sort of like one of those bad films where, well, actually, I'll go in a different direction. They just weren't thinking in that sense. It looked like they were wearing the pants in this relationship, and they just weren't really considering, why are we getting such favorable treatment? And of course, it goes back to the previous answer. Like, well, China had its own narrative. It wasn't wanting to be part of Pax Americana. It had its own ideas of rebuilding a 5,000-year civilization and was sort of using foreign actors to get there. But if you're not thinking like that, then you sort of miss the biggest picture, or biggest part of the picture, I should say.
Right. Well, that was one of my questions, was whether they could have predicted that it's gonna go that way. But I guess they couldn't, but maybe no one could, because even I think for experts, it was quite unpredictable that China with Xi would go down this way, and that it would also at the same time be able to act so strategically and so aggressively at the same time to make all this happen.
So yes and no. I mean, I spoke to someone as recently as yesterday who said, I won't give the year, but let's say well before 2010, they warned Tim Cook about over reliance on China and maybe what is China's end game. So you did have some people thinking about this kind of stuff. And in the book, I mentioned a few examples. So when the the original iPod is built in Taiwan by a company called Inventec, and it's not until Foxconn very cleverly sort of orchestrates their own job interview and ends up winning the iPod Mini contract that things go to China. And it's just at the same time that they're having all these problems building what's called the iMac G4. People remember it. It looks like a sunflower, like sort of floating towards you. That computer also was built in Taiwan by another company called Quanta, and they have so many problems that Quanta sets up QSMC, Quanta Shanghai. And so everything begins to consolidate into China around 2003. And Tony Fadell is just at that time becoming senior vice president, right? He's got this crazy narrative where from 8 or 9 year period, he goes from a contractor at Apple to a senior vice president in charge not only of the iPod, but basically in charge of the iPhone. So they're like, the iPod at this time is more than 50% of Apple revenue. And then at the same time, he's beginning to take over what's going to become the iPhone, which is like the most iconic device ever. The resentment against Tony Fadell is just palpable. I mean, even today, and people are upset that he's in the book and that kind of stuff. I don't over rely on him, I should say, but the fact that he's sort of quoted in a good way at all has pissed off loads of people. And I'll defend it. I think he's an extremely important figure. But he is overseeing this, and he's understanding that too much is moving to China. So he's in the book saying, look, I get that it makes sense to move to China, but we're going to be overexposed here. Having everything in one place just isn't a good idea. Now, I don't know anything about Tony Fadell's politics. I don't know if he was suggesting when I talked to him about this that the possibility of a strong man taking China in a different direction was the reason why he was fearful about it. I think he was just thinking, just basic supply chain 101 is you just don't put all your eggs in one basket. So you have him, and there's other people as well. But the answers that you get even today, and I say today because we have 2020 hindsight of which direction China went in, I'll still talk to people who worked closely with Steve Jobs for more than 10 years, and they would say, where else would you have us go? Like, there was no alternative. Like, you have to recall that the iPhone was becoming the most iconic product of the 21st century after the iPod had already played that role. iPhone and then iPod, if I didn't say that right. And the demands that they had to satisfy globally was just absolutely extraordinary. So the idea that they were going to build massive resilience into their supply chain by building up entire industrial clusters in Mexico or India just wasn't going to happen. I mean, they're trying to do that now, and it's not really happening. And among the reasons it's not happening is because however much you can make big investments in the engineering talent in India, you can't build the high-speed rail. That's not Apple's job. You can't build the ports. You can't build the 8-lane highways. Poverty alleviation is not really Apple's goal in India. And so unless the Indian government really steps up their game, they're not really going to compete with China anytime soon. But China was just knocking it out of the park on that kind of stuff. So they're just the perfect once-in-a-century partner for Apple. And you can't understand Apple's rise if you don't understand China's rise.
Well, that was sort of my next question, whether the situation that you were describing back then is still the case today, that China is still, that it's still so much harder for a company like Apple to build anything anywhere else than in China, or if that has changed at least a little bit, because if it hasn't, then that I would say is quite a big problem for a lot of Western companies. Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.